Sarah Mitchell thought she knew exactly who she was until the day she destroyed someone's life with a single lie. The elementary school principal with the perfect marriage, spotless reputation, and unwavering moral compass never imagined she'd become the villain in someone else's story. But sometimes the darkest parts of human nature emerge when we least expect them. Sarah had built her entire identity around being good. She volunteered at the local food bank every weekend, never missed church on Sundays, and had spent 15 years molding young minds at Oakwood Elementary. Her colleagues respected her, parents trusted her, and children adored her warm smile and patient demeanor. Even her husband Mark often joked that he'd married a saint, though lately his tone carried less admiration and more distance. The first crack in her perfect facade appeared on a Tuesday morning in October. Sarah sat in her office reviewing budget cuts that would force her to lay off 3 teachers before Christmas. The district had been clear: eliminate positions or face closure. Her hands trembled as she stared at the personnel files spread across her mahogany desk. Each folder represented a family, dreams, mortgage payments, and children's college funds. Jessica Flores, the newest hire, sat at the top of the termination list. Fresh out of college with student loans that would crush most people, Jessica brought infectious energy to her second-grade classroom. The kids loved her bilingual storytelling sessions, and she'd already implemented innovative reading programs that showed measurable results. But policy was policy. Last hired, first fired. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Mark, "Working late again. Don't wait up." The message stung more than usual. Their conversations had become purely functional lately, reduced to scheduling conflicts and household logistics. She couldn't remember the last time they'd laughed together or shared anything deeper than grocery lists and bill payments. Dr. Elizabeth Chen knocked on the door, interrupting Sarah's spiraling thoughts. The school psychologist had requested this meeting to discuss concerns about several students showing signs of emotional distress. Sarah respected Elizabeth's expertise, but lately she'd grown tired of the constant psychological analysis and professional boundaries that seemed to govern every interaction. "Sarah, I wanted to discuss Marcus Thompson's behavioral changes," Elizabeth began, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk. "His aggression has escalated, and I believe there might be issues at home that require intervention." Marcus was a troubled 8-year-old whose single mother worked 3 jobs to keep their apartment. Sarah had watched him struggle academically and socially, often acting out when he felt overwhelmed or ignored. She'd developed a soft spot for the boy, seeing herself in his fierce independence and stubborn pride. "What kind of intervention are you suggesting?" Sarah asked, though she already dreaded the answer. "I think we need to involve Child Protective Services. The bruising patterns I've documented, combined with his behavioral regression, suggest possible abuse. I know his mother, Maria, seems caring, but we have an obligation to report our suspicions." Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd met Maria Thompson several times during parent conferences and school events. The woman worked herself to exhaustion providing for Marcus, often arriving to pick him up still wearing her cleaning uniform from the hospital. Maria's eyes always carried the weight of someone fighting an uphill battle, but Sarah had never seen anything suggesting abuse. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully controlled. CPS involvement could destroy their family. Maria could lose her jobs, Marcus could end up in foster care, and they might never recover from the trauma of investigation. Elizabeth leaned forward, her expression serious but compassionate. "I understand your concerns, Sarah, but we're mandated reporters. The evidence suggests Marcus is being harmed, and waiting could make things worse. I've already prepared the documentation." That evening, Sarah drove home through the familiar suburban streets that usually brought her comfort. Tonight, the manicured lawns and perfect houses felt like a facade hiding countless secrets and struggles. She thought about Jessica facing unemployment, Maria potentially losing her son, and her own marriage slowly dissolving despite all her efforts to maintain appearances. Mark was already asleep when she entered their bedroom, his back turned toward her side of the bed. Sarah stared at his still form and wondered when they'd stopped being partners and started being strangers sharing living expenses. The distance between them felt insurmountable, like trying to bridge an ocean with good intentions and polite conversation. She pulled Elizabeth's CPS report from her briefcase and read through the clinical language describing Marcus's situation. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that Elizabeth was misreading the signs, that destroying Maria's life wouldn't save Marcus. But questioning a licensed psychologist's professional judgment could end Sarah's own career and reputation. As she stared at the document that could shatter a family, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. The moral certainty that had guided her entire life began to crack, replaced by something darker and more desperate. For the first time in her adult life, she considered doing something that would benefit herself at someone else's expense. The decision she was about to make would reveal that even the most principled people are capable of devastating choices when pushed to their breaking point. Sarah's finger hovered over Elizabeth's cell phone number for 20 minutes before she finally made the call that would haunt her forever. She'd spent the entire night rehearsing the words, convincing herself that what she was about to do served the greater good. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was about to sacrifice an innocent woman to protect her own crumbling world. "Elizabeth, it's Sarah. I need to discuss something confidential about the Thompson case." Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "I've discovered information that changes everything." The psychologist answered immediately, concern evident in her tone. "What kind of information?" "If there's additional evidence of abuse, we need to act immediately." Sarah closed her eyes and crossed a line she never thought she'd approach. "It's not about abuse. I've learned that Maria Thompson has been involved in illegal activities, drug dealing specifically. I witnessed a transaction yesterday evening when I drove past their apartment complex." The silence on the other end stretched uncomfortably long. Sarah's heart pounded so loudly she worried Elizabeth might hear it through the phone. Everything about this felt wrong, but the alternatives seemed worse. If Elizabeth proceeded with the abuse investigation and found nothing, she'd look incompetent. If Sarah could redirect the focus to drug activity, Maria would still face consequences, but Marcus might end up in a safer situation with relatives instead of foster care. Sarah, that's a serious accusation. Are you absolutely certain about what you saw? Elizabeth's professional training kicked in, but Sarah could hear the doubt creeping into her voice. I saw Maria exchange money in small packages with multiple individuals in the parking lot. The behavior was consistent with street-level drug distribution. I couldn't sleep last night thinking about Marcus living in that environment. Each word felt like swallowing glass, but Sarah pushed forward. Maybe his behavioral issues stem from exposure to illegal activity rather than physical abuse. Elizabeth sighed heavily. This changes our reporting requirements entirely. If Maria is involved in drug trafficking, we need to contact law enforcement immediately. Not just CPS. Marcus would need emergency protective custody. Sarah felt the weight of what she'd set in motion. Within hours, police would raid Maria's apartment, searching for drugs that didn't exist. They'd tear apart the modest home that Maria had worked 3 jobs to maintain. Marcus would be traumatized by watching his mother arrested, possibly for years if the false charges led to conviction. But Sarah had bought herself time. Jessica wouldn't be laid off this week while everyone dealt with the Thompson crisis. The budget cuts could be delayed, maybe reassigned to different personnel. Mark might even notice her dedication to protecting her teachers and remember why he'd fallen in love with her years ago. I'll handle the police report personally, Sarah continued, each word dragging her deeper into deception. Given my position and the sensitive nature of the situation, I think it's better if the information comes through official channels. After ending the call, Sarah sat in her car outside the school, watching early morning staff arrive for another day of shaping young minds. She'd just destroyed an innocent woman's life to save her own reputation and marriage. The irony wasn't lost on her. The principal who taught children about honesty and integrity had become a master manipulator in less than 12 hours. Detective James Martinez met Sarah at the police station that afternoon. His weathered face and patient demeanor reminded her of her father, which made the lies even harder to deliver. She repeated her fabricated story with careful details, describing times and locations she'd invented during her sleepless night. Mrs. Mitchell, I appreciate you coming forward, but I have to ask, why didn't you report this immediately when you witnessed the alleged drug activity? Detective Martinez's question cut through her prepared narrative. Sarah had anticipated this. Honestly, Detective, I hoped I was wrong. Maria seems like a caring mother despite her circumstances, and I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. But when Dr. Chun presented evidence of possible abuse, I realized I couldn't protect Marcus by staying silent about what I'd seen. The detective nodded, making notes in his file. We'll need to move quickly on this. Drug activity near a school zone carries enhanced penalties, and if there's child endangerment involved, we're looking at immediate custody issues. That evening, Sarah stood at her kitchen window watching Mark tend their garden. He moved with the same methodical precision he brought to everything, measuring fertilizer, checking soil moisture, documenting growth patterns in his notebook. Their relationship had become equally systematic, devoid of spontaneity or genuine connection. "How was your day?" Mark asked when he came inside, washing soil from his hands at the kitchen sink. The question felt automatic, like asking about weather. Challenging. "We're dealing with a difficult family situation at school." Sarah kept her voice neutral, though internally she screamed with guilt and terror. A student's home environment isn't safe. Mark dried his hands and turned to face her. For a moment, Sarah saw something flicker in his expression: concern, maybe even tenderness. "That must be hard for you. I know how much you care about your students." The kindness in his voice nearly broke her resolve. Sarah wanted to confess everything, to collapse into his arms and admit that she'd become someone neither of them would recognize, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she nodded and turned away, afraid he'd see the truth written across her face. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elizabeth. "Police raid scheduled for tomorrow morning. I'll be there to ensure Marcus's psychological well-being during the transition. Thank you for having the courage to speak up." Sarah stared at the message until the words blurred. Tomorrow, Maria Thompson would lose everything because of a lie designed to save Sarah's career and marriage. The psychology behind her actions was becoming clearer. When good people feel cornered, they're capable of rationalization that would shock their former selves. She'd always believed evil was obvious, perpetrated by obviously bad people making obviously wrong choices. But standing in her perfect kitchen, wearing her professional attire, surrounded by symbols of her moral life, Sarah realized that evil often wears the mask of self-preservation and good intentions. The most terrifying part wasn't what she'd done, it was how easily she'd done it, and how natural it felt to sacrifice someone else's happiness for her own survival. The blood under Miguel Rodriguez's fingernails wasn't from abusing his daughter. It was from clawing desperately at his jail cell walls while screaming his innocence to guards who'd already decided his guilt. Valentina discovered this detail buried in a police report 3 days after his arrest, and the image haunted her more than any nightmare she'd ever experienced. She'd created a monster story about Miguel, but the real monster was staring back at her from every mirror in her house. Detective Sarah Kim's investigation was more thorough than Valentina had anticipated. The seasoned officer had spent 15 years working child abuse cases and possessed an intuition for detecting fabricated evidence that made Valentina's stomach clench with terror every time her phone rang. During their second interview, Kim's questions carried surgical precision that cut through Valentina's rehearsed responses like a scalpel through lies. "Ms. Cross, I've reviewed the timeline of your witness statement regarding Miguel Rodriguez's alleged abuse of Carmen. You claim to have observed concerning interactions on multiple occasions over several months, but there's no record of you documenting these observations until after Dr. Vance recommended CPS involvement." Kim's weathered hands arranged photographs across the metal table, each image time-stamped and dated. "That seems unusual for someone in your profession." Valentina forced herself to maintain eye contact while her internal organs felt like they were dissolving in acid. "Detective, I hope the situations I witnessed were misunderstandings. As a counselor, I'm trained to look for patterns of behavior rather than jumping to conclusions based on isolated incidents. I only came forward when Carmen's psychological state deteriorated to the point where intervention became necessary." But Kim wasn't convinced, and her follow-up questions probed deeper into inconsistencies Valentina hadn't considered during her panicked fabrication. The detective had interviewed Carmen extensively, and the teenager's genuine confusion about the abuse allegations contradicted the detailed trauma symptoms Valentina had described in her false report. Carmen Rodriguez shows no signs of sexual trauma, no behavioral indicators consistent with ongoing abuse, and maintains that her relationship with her father has always been supportive and loving. Kim continued, her voice carrying the weight of professional skepticism. "In fact, she's been asking to see him constantly, which is unusual behavior for abuse victims." The walls of the interview room felt like they were closing in, but Valentina had become skilled at manufacturing confidence under pressure. She'd spent hours researching psychological defense mechanisms, preparing explanations for why Carmen might not recognize her own victimization. "Detective, it's not uncommon for abuse victims to develop strong attachment to their abusers, especially in cases involving single-parent families where the child fears losing their only caregiver. Carmen's loyalty to her father might actually support the trauma indicators rather than contradicting them." Kim leaned back in her chair, studying Valentina with the patience of someone who'd spent decades recognizing deception. The silence stretched uncomfortably long before she spoke again. "We've also interviewed Miguel Rodriguez extensively. His story is consistent, detailed, and corroborated by multiple independent sources. His employers, neighbors, and Carmen's teachers all describe him as a devoted single father who sacrificed everything for his daughter's education and welfare." Valentina felt sweat beading on her forehead despite the interview room's aggressive air conditioning. Each question revealed another crack in her fabricated narrative, exposing the amateur nature of her deception to professional scrutiny. She'd underestimated the thoroughness of criminal investigation, assuming her professional credentials would provide sufficient credibility to avoid detailed examination. People can hide criminal behavior behind facades of respectability, detective. Some of the worst predators are those who appear most devoted to their victims. Miguel Rodriguez's public image doesn't negate the private reality of what Carmen has endured. That evening, Valentina sat in her car outside Carmen's temporary foster home, watching through lit windows as the teenager struggled with homework alone. The family hosting Carmen seemed kind but overwhelmed, juggling multiple foster children while dealing with their own biological kids. Carmen's college preparation materials sat untouched on the desk, her academic future derailing with each day spent away from her father's support and encouragement. The guilt was becoming physically unbearable. Valentina had developed constant headaches, her appetite had vanished, and sleep brought only nightmares of Miguel's terrified face as police officers placed him in handcuffs. She'd convinced herself she was saving Carmen from abuse, But watching the girl's obvious misery and confusion made the rationalization impossible to maintain. David noticed her deterioration immediately. The renewed closeness in their marriage felt simultaneously precious and hollow. Love built on lies that would destroy everything if revealed. He brought her soup when she claimed stomach problems, massaged her shoulders when headaches left her incapacitated, and offered emotional support that made her feel like the worst person alive. "Valentina, you're pushing yourself too hard with this Rodriguez case," David said one evening, finding her staring blankly at case files spread across their kitchen table. "Maybe you should let someone else handle the follow-up investigation." She looked up at her husband's concerned face and wanted desperately to confess everything. The weight of her deception was crushing her soul, transforming every moment of happiness into guilt-soaked agony. But admitting the truth would destroy not just her career and marriage, but also Carmen's life, Miguel's freedom, and possibly Natasha's job security. "I can't abandon Carmen now," Valentina managed, each word feeling like swallowing broken glass. "She needs someone who understands her situation to advocate for her welfare." But privately, Valentina knew she was trapped in a web of her own creation. Each lie required additional deception to maintain credibility. She'd had to fabricate detailed observations, create timelines that seemed plausible, and invent psychological assessments that painted Miguel as a master manipulator. The scope of her dishonesty had expanded far beyond her original desperate impulse. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca Vance. "Valentina, Carmen's psychological evaluation results are concerning. She's showing signs of severe trauma, but not from abuse, from separation anxiety and disruption of her primary attachment relationship. Her symptoms suggest the removal from her father might be more harmful than the alleged abuse we were trying to prevent." Valentina stared at the message until the words blurred with tears she couldn't allow herself to shed. Carmen's trauma wasn't from her father's abuse, it was from Valentina's lies tearing apart the only family the girl had ever known. The teenager was suffering because her trusted counselor had decided Miguel's life was an acceptable sacrifice for her own survival. The psychology of evil was revealing itself through bitter personal experience. Valentina had always imagined moral corruption as a dramatic transformation, good people becoming obviously bad through clear moral choices. Instead, she'd learned that evil often masquerades as problem-solving, practical decision-making designed to minimize harm while actually maximizing destruction. She'd convinced herself she was protecting multiple people, Carmen from abuse, Natasha from unemployment, her marriage from financial stress, herself from career destruction. But sitting in her kitchen, surrounded by fabricated evidence and hollow victories, Valentina realized she'd simply prioritized her own needs over everyone else's well-being, while crafting elaborate justifications for fundamentally selfish choices. The most terrifying part wasn't what she'd become, it was how natural it felt to sacrifice others for her own benefit, and how easily she could rationalize continued deception as necessary for everyone's protection. Miguel Rodriguez was innocent, Carmen was traumatized, and Valentina Cross had learned that the distance between saint and monster could be crossed with a single signature on a document built entirely of lies. Choice was clear, obvious, screaming at her from every moral principle she'd ever claimed to hold. Instead, she doubled down. "I know what I witnessed, Elizabeth. Maybe they cleared everything out after my report yesterday. Drug dealers aren't stupid. They know how to hide evidence when they suspect surveillance." Sarah's voice grew stronger with each lie, as if deception was a skill she'd been practicing for years instead of days. "But Sarah, the neighbors say Maria works 3 jobs and is barely home except to sleep. When would she have time for drug dealing? And Marcus's behavioral issues align more with neglect due to her work schedule than exposure to criminal activity." Sarah felt Elizabeth's professional instincts pushing against the false narrative, but she'd come too far to retreat now. People can hide criminal behavior behind legitimate activities. "I trusted my instincts when I saw the transaction, and I stand by my report. Maybe the investigation needs more time." That afternoon, Sarah met with the school district's crisis counselor to discuss Marcus's placement. The boy would be transferred to his grandmother's custody in another state while Maria fought charges that could result in years of imprisonment. Sarah listened to plans for counseling and educational transition support, nodding appropriately while her stomach churned with self-hatred. "It's always difficult when we discover that parents aren't who they appear to be," the counselor commented while reviewing Marcus's file. "Thank goodness you recognized the signs and reported your concerns. That boy could have been exposed to dangerous situations for years." Sarah accepted the praise like poison, each word of commendation burning her throat. She'd become expert at accepting credit for protecting a child, while knowing she'd actually destroy his family. The cognitive dissonance was becoming easier to manage, which terrified her more than the initial lies. Her marriage showed unexpected signs of improvement. Mark commented over dinner about news reports of the drug arrest at Oakwood Elementary, praising Sarah's vigilance and community leadership. For the first time in months, he looked at her with something resembling admiration. "I'm proud of you for taking such a difficult stand," Mark said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "It couldn't have been easy to report a parent, but you put Marcus's safety first. That takes real courage." Sarah squeezed back, feeling the warmth of human connection she'd been craving for months. The attention felt like sunlight after weeks of gray weather, and she found herself basking in Mark's renewed respect and affection. Their conversation flowed naturally for the first time in ages, covering dreams, memories, and future plans that didn't involve separate bedrooms and polite distance. But later that night, alone in her study, Sarah researched Maria Thompson's case online. Local news coverage painted Maria as a dangerous criminal who'd endangered children while maintaining a facade of respectability. The comments section overflowed with outrage and calls for harsh punishment. Sarah read each word knowing she'd authored this narrative with calculated lies. She found Maria's social media profile, scrolling through photos that told a different story. Marcus's birthday parties in their modest apartment, School achievement certificates taped to the refrigerator, mother and son at community events and church functions. Every image contradicted the criminal portrait Sarah had painted for law enforcement. One photo stopped her scrolling entirely. Maria and Marcus at last year's school carnival, standing in front of Sarah's dunking booth. Sarah remembered the day clearly now. Maria had purchased extra tickets to support school fundraising, despite obviously limited finances. She'd laughed genuinely when Marcus finally managed to dunk Sarah into the tank, applauding his victory with pure maternal joy. Sarah stared at the image until her vision blurred with tears she couldn't allow herself to shed. She'd destroyed someone who'd shown her nothing but respect and kindness. Maria's only crime had been existing as a convenient scapegoat when Sarah needed someone to sacrifice for her own survival. The psychology behind her behavior was becoming crystal clear. Good people don't gradually become evil through dramatic transformation. They cross moral boundaries one small compromise at a time, each transgression making the next one easier to justify. Sarah had convinced herself she was protecting Marcus, saving Jessica's job, preserving her marriage, all while serving her own desperate need to maintain control. Tomorrow she would wake up, dress professionally, and continue teaching children about honesty and integrity while living as someone who'd proven capable of breathtaking cruelty. The most disturbing realization wasn't that she'd become evil, it was how comfortable she was beginning to feel with her new identity. 3 weeks after the raid, Sarah's carefully constructed lies began to crack under the weight of Detective Martinez's persistent investigation. She sat across from him in the same interview room where she'd first spun her web of deception, but this time his questions carried the sharp edge of suspicion rather than grateful cooperation. "Mrs. Mitchell, we've reviewed security footage from the apartment complex for the dates you specified. There's no record of the drug transaction you described witnessing." His weathered hands spread photographs across the metal table, each image time-stamped and dated. "In fact, there's no footage of you ever being in that parking lot." Sarah's throat constricted, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact. "Security cameras have blind spots, Detective. I parked on the street, not in the complex itself. And the lighting was poor. Maybe the cameras didn't capture what I saw clearly." Martinez leaned back, studying her with the patience of someone who'd spent decades recognizing deception. "We also interviewed every resident in the building. Multiple neighbors confirmed that Maria Thompson worked nights at the hospital, evenings at the grocery store, and weekends cleaning offices. When exactly did she have time to run a drug operation?" The walls felt like they were closing in, but Sarah had become skillful at manufacturing confidence under pressure. "Criminal activity doesn't follow normal schedules, Detective. People can hide illegal behavior even from close neighbors. I know what I witnessed." But privately, Sarah knew the investigation was closing in on her fabrications. She'd underestimated law enforcement's thoroughness, assuming they'd accept her word without extensive verification. Every night brought new anxiety about phone calls that might expose her lies. Every day at school felt like performing normalcy while standing on quicksand. The emotional toll was becoming visible. Mark commented on her weight loss and restless sleep, but attributed it to work stress rather than crushing guilt. Sarah had become expert at accepting his concern while hiding the true source of her deterioration. Their renewed closeness felt simultaneously precious and hollow love built on lies that would shatter everything if revealed. Jessica Flores knocked on Sarah's office door during lunch, carrying a handmade thank you card from her second-grade class. "The kids wanted to show their appreciation for you keeping me on staff," Jessica said with a bright smile that cut through Sarah's defenses like glass. "I know the budget situation is difficult, but your support means everything to my family." Sarah accepted the card with trembling hands, each colorful drawing and misspelled message of gratitude feeling like an indictment. She'd saved Jessica's job by destroying Maria's life, creating a chain of consequences that she couldn't have anticipated. The mathematics of morality had proven more complex than simple addition and subtraction. "You've been such an advocate for our teaching staff," Jessica continued. "I heard about your role in the Thompson investigation, too. It must be hard to see families in crisis, but you did the right thing protecting Marcus." That afternoon, Sarah received a call that made her blood turn cold. Elizabeth's voice carried professional concern mixed with growing suspicion about inconsistencies in the case. "Sarah, I've been reviewing Marcus's psychological evaluation from his new placement. His grandmother reports that he's been asking about drug accusations against his mother, saying they're impossible because Maria has never used substances due to her father's alcoholism. He's also mentioned specific details about his mother's work schedule that contradict our timeline." Sarah gripped her phone tighter, feeling sweat bead on her forehead despite the office air conditioning. Children often don't understand the full scope of their parents' activities, especially illegal ones. Marcus wouldn't necessarily be aware of drug dealing if Maria was protecting him from that knowledge. Perhaps, but there's another concern. I spoke with Maria's attorney yesterday. The defense is questioning the reliability of eyewitness testimony, particularly given the lack of physical evidence. They're requesting detailed statements from all witnesses, including you. The legal system was now scrutinizing Sarah's lies with professional expertise she couldn't match. Defense attorneys were trained to find inconsistencies, to question timelines, to expose fabrications. She'd entered an arena where her amateur deception would face expert analysis. That evening, Sarah stood in her bathroom staring at her reflection, barely recognizing the person looking back. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, stress lines marked her forehead, and her professional composure had been replaced by constant vigilance. She'd gained a reprieve in her marriage and saved Jessica's career, but the cost was becoming someone she despised. Mark appeared in the doorway, concern evident in his expression. "Sarah, you look exhausted. Maybe you should take some time off. Let someone else handle the Thompson situation while you recover." The kindness in his voice nearly broke her resolve. Sarah wanted to confess everything: the lies, the fabricated evidence, the innocent woman facing prison because of her selfish desperation. But admitting the truth would destroy everything: her career, her marriage, her reputation, Jessica's job security. The web of consequences had grown too complex to unravel without collateral damage. "I just need some sleep," Sarah managed, turning away from both Mark and her reflection. "The investigation has been emotionally draining, but sleep brought no peace." Sarah's dreams filled with images of Marcus crying for his arrested mother, Maria sitting in jail wondering why her life had been destroyed, Detective Martinez discovering evidence of her lies. She'd thought evil was something dramatic and obvious, perpetrated by people different from herself. Instead, she'd learned that moral collapse often begins with small compromises that snowball into devastating choices. The next morning brought news that made her blood freeze. Maria Thompson, S defense attorney, had filed a motion challenging the reliability of witness testimony and requesting full disclosure of all evidence. Sarah's fabricated witness statement would soon face legal scrutiny designed to expose exactly the kind of lies she deconstructed. She sat in her office, staring at Jessica's thank you card while contemplating the approaching moment of truth. The children's innocent drawings and grateful messages mocked her from the desktop, reminders that her protection of one teacher had been purchased with another family's destruction. The psychology of evil was becoming clear through bitter personal experience. Good people become capable of terrible things when they prioritize their own survival over others' well-being. Sarah had convinced herself she was protecting multiple people while actually serving her own desperate needs. The most disturbing part wasn't her capacity for deception, it was how natural it had become to sacrifice others for her own benefit. The courtroom where Valentina Cross would finally face judgment felt like a cathedral of justice, but she knew she was about to be condemned by her own lies rather than saved by any divine intervention. Miguel Rodriguez sat at the defense table looking 20 years older than his actual age, his construction-weathered hands folded in prayer while his daughter, Carmen, testified about the loving father who'd sacrificed everything for her future. The truth was finally emerging, and it was about to destroy everyone Valentina had convinced herself she was protecting. Detective Kim's testimony dismantled every aspect of Valentina's fabricated evidence with surgical precision. Security footage, work records, witness statements, and timeline analysis systematically exposed each lie she'd constructed during her desperate attempt to save her career. The courtroom gallery filled with Valentina's former colleagues, students, and community members who'd trusted her judgment for 15 years, all witnessing the revelation that their respected counselor was capable of breathtaking cruelty. The defendant's false accusations against Mr. Rodriguez were not mistakes or misinterpretations. Detective Kim testified, her voice carrying the weight of professional authority. They were deliberate fabrications designed to create a crisis that would delay school budget cuts and preserve Miss Cross's employment. She systematically destroyed an innocent family to serve her own financial and professional interests. Valentina sat beside her court-appointed attorney, watching her carefully constructed world crumble with each piece of evidence presented against her. The woman who'd spent decades teaching young people about integrity and moral courage had become a case study in how good people can commit unthinkable evil when they prioritize self-preservation over others' well-being. Carmen Rodriguez took the witness stand with quiet dignity that made Valentina's guilt feel physically unbearable. The 17-year-old honor student spoke about her father's devotion, their close relationship, and the devastating trauma of watching him arrested based on false accusations from someone she'd trusted completely. "Ms. Cross was my guidance counselor for 4 years," Carmen testified, her voice steady despite visible tears. "I trusted her with my college dreams, my fears about fitting in, my worries about my dad working so hard to support us. She knew everything about our family, about how much my father loved me. That's what makes her lies so much worse. She knew the truth about us, and she chose to destroy it anyway." The prosecutor's closing argument painted a devastating portrait of moral collapse that resonated throughout the packed courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case isn't just about false accusations or filing fraudulent reports. It's about the betrayal of sacred trust between a counselor and the family she was sworn to protect. Valentina Cross didn't make a mistake. She made a calculated decision to sacrifice an innocent family on the altar of her own desperation. Valentina's attorney attempted to argue that job stress and mental health issues had impaired her judgment, but the evidence of deliberate deception was too overwhelming to overcome. Phone records, documented lies, fabricated timelines, and systematic character assassination painted a clear picture of someone who'd crossed moral boundaries with full awareness of the consequences. When the guilty verdict was announced, Valentina felt something break inside her chest that she knew could never be repaired. The judge's voice seemed to echo from a great distance as he sentenced her to 3 years in prison for filing false reports, perjury, and obstruction of justice. But the legal consequences paled compared to the personal destruction her choices had wrought. David filed for divorce before she'd even been processed into the correctional facility. Their final conversation took place through reinforced glass, speaking through phones that made their words sound mechanical and distant. The man who'd loved her for 22 years looked at her like she was a stranger he'd never really known. "I keep trying to find some trace of the woman I married in what you've done," David said, his voice broken with grief and confusion. "But I can't reconcile the person who helped me become a better man with someone capable of destroying an innocent family. I don't know who you really are, Valentina, and I don't think you do either." 6 months into her sentence, Valentina received a letter that would haunt her more than any nightmare. Carmen Rodriguez had been accepted to Harvard University with a full scholarship, but the trauma and disruption from the false abuse allegations had affected her psychological state and academic performance. The admissions committee had withdrawn their offer after reviewing her recent psychological evaluations and academic decline during her father's legal ordeal. Miguel Rodriguez had been completely exonerated, but the damage extended far beyond legal vindication. He'd lost his construction job, their apartment, and most of their savings to legal fees. The family had moved to a different state to escape the stigma and media attention, starting over with nothing but their integrity and the knowledge that they'd survived a nightmare orchestrated by someone they'd trusted. Valentina spent her days in prison writing letters of apology that she knew could never adequately address the scope of destruction she'd caused. The psychology of evil had revealed itself through her own transformation. She hadn't become a monster through dramatic conversion, but through a series of seemingly practical decisions that prioritized her needs over others' fundamental humanity. The most devastating realization wasn't that she'd been capable of such cruelty, but how easily she'd rationalized each step of her moral collapse. She'd convinced herself she was protecting Carmen from abuse, saving Natasha from unemployment, preserving her marriage from financial stress, and maintaining her career to help other students. Every justification had been a lie designed to mask her willingness to sacrifice others for her own benefit. Educational programs at the correctional facility used Valentina's case as a study in criminal psychology and ethical decision-making. She found herself discussing her transformation with researchers and graduate students, helping them understand how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary evil when they face perceived threats to everything they value. The scariest part, Valentina told one psychology researcher, is how normal it felt while I was doing it. I didn't wake up one day and decide to become evil. I just made one small compromise to solve an immediate problem, then another to cover the first, then another to maintain the lie. Each step felt reasonable and necessary at the time. 3 years later, Valentina was released into a world that had moved on without her. Her teaching license was permanently revoked, her professional reputation destroyed, and her personal relationships shattered beyond repair. She found work cleaning offices at night, moving through the same buildings where she'd once been respected and admired, now invisible to people who'd once sought her guidance. The story of Valentina Cross became required reading in ethics courses, psychology programs, and criminal justice studies. Students analyzed her transformation from respected educator to convicted criminal, examining how moral failure often begins with small compromises that escalate through self-serving rationalization. Her case illustrated the uncomfortable truth that evil rarely announces itself dramatically. It often wears the mask of practical problem-solving and good intentions. Miguel and Carmen Rodriguez had rebuilt their lives in a new city, but the scars from Valentina's lies would affect them forever. Carmen eventually completed her education at a state university rather than Harvard, her dreams permanently altered by someone else's willingness to sacrifice her family's well-being for personal gain. Miguel found work in construction again, but he never fully recovered from the trauma of imprisonment for crimes he didn't commit. Valentina's legacy wasn't the 15 years of dedicated service to troubled teenagers, but the 3 months of lies that destroyed an innocent family. She'd learned too late that the psychology of evil doesn't require dramatic transformation or obvious moral choices. Sometimes it simply requires prioritizing your own survival over others' humanity, then convincing yourself that your selfishness serves some greater good. The most chilling lesson from her story isn't that monsters exist among us, but that anyone is capable of becoming one when they decide their own needs matter more than others' lives. The distance between saint and sinner, between protector and predator, between good and evil, isn't as vast as most people believe. Sometimes it's just one desperate decision away, disguised as practical necessity and justified by elaborate rationalization. In the end, Valentina Cross's story serves as a terrifying reminder that moral character isn't measured by how we behave when life is comfortable, but by the choices we make when everything we value hangs in the balance. The psychology of evil often wears the face of ordinary people making extraordinary choices to protect themselves, then spending the rest of their lives living with the devastating consequences of prioritizing their own survival over others' fundamental humanity.